From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Get off the property. The police are coming.
Why are you evicting someone in a pandemic?
As COVID cases and deaths shatter world records in the United States, millions of people risk losing their homes in the middle of the pandemic. As a federal moratorium on evictions is about to end, we'll get the latest. Then we'll speak to Indigenous activist Winona LaDuke about Joe Biden's selection of Deb Haaland to be the first Native American to serve as Interior Secretary. We'll also look at the ongoing protests against the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota.
We're asking you to come to the river and pray. You know, there are a lot of people up here, and there need to be more. This is our river. These are public lands that they are taking for this Canadian multinational corporation.
Then a shocking new expose in The Intercept reveals CIA-trained and funded death squads have targeted Islamic religious schools in Afghanistan, killing boys as young as 8 years old.
These militia networks have been implicated, according to our reporting, in a number of incidents, including summary executions, massacres, bombing of civilian houses, mutilations, and the list goes on.
Was this campaign of terror part of the Trump administration's exit strategy from Afghanistan? We'll find out. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States has logged its second worst day of the pandemic after shattering records just one day earlier. On Thursday, the U.S. recorded over 233,000 new infections and nearly 3,300 deaths. Intensive care units in Southern California and other parts of the state report they have run out of ICU beds. On average, 2 people are dying of COVID-19 each hour in Los Angeles. Meanwhile, lawyers representing patients at Southern California's largest psychiatric hospital are demanding the release or transfer of hundreds of people amidst a massive outbreak that sickened nearly 700 patients and killed 10. The lawyers describe the state-run Patton State Hospital as a tinderbox for COVID-19. On Thursday, a panel of vaccine experts recommended the FDA grant emergency use authorization to Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine for people 18 and older. Final FDA approval could come as early as today. This comes as governors around the U.S. report their states are receiving significantly fewer doses of Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine than planned. A spokesperson for Pfizer has millions of doses, he says, in cold storage in its warehouse, but is awaiting instructions from the Trump administration on how to distribute them. As we go to broadcast, Vice President Mike Pence and Second Lady Karen Pence and Surgeon General Jerome Adams are being publicly vaccinated. The White House says President Trump won't be vaccinated until it's recommended by his medical team. Lawmakers continue to haggle over a $900 billion stimulus bill, with talks likely extending past tonight's midnight deadline to avoid a government shutdown. White House aides reportedly talked President Trump out of insisting on stimulus checks for as much as $2,000 as part of the relief package, saying it would, quote, blow up negotiations. The bill in its current form is expected to include one-time payments of just $600. This comes as new figures show another 885,000 people filed new claims for unemployment benefits last week, the highest weekly level in 3 months. Nearly 500,000 more people filed for pandemic unemployment assistance, a federal aid program for part-time and self-employed workers. New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is calling for new leadership in the Democratic Party, which she says will help ensure progressive gains like Medicare for all. She made the comments in a recent interview on Podcast Intercepted.
You know, for me personally, it was when I was waitressing and I would hear Democrats talk about why the Affordable Care Act was so amazing all the time and how this is the greatest thing ever and the economy's doing wonderfully. And frankly, it is the same trick that Trump pulls, which is, you know, people touting the Dow as a measure of economic success when we're all getting killed out here. And so, do we need new leadership of the Democratic Party? Absolutely. But how do we ensure that when we shift, we don't even move further to the right?
President-elect Joe Biden has nominated New Mexico Congressmember Deb Haaland to become Secretary of the Interior. If confirmed, Haaland would be the first Native American to serve as a cabinet secretary. Haaland's nomination was backed by progressives as well as more than 120 tribal leaders who sent a letter to Joe Biden last month urging him to select her for the post. Haaland responded in a statement, quote, "As our country faces the impacts of climate change and environmental injustice, the Interior has a role, and I will be a partner in addressing these challenges by protecting our public lands and moving our country towards a clean energy future," unquote. We'll have more on Deb Haaland's historic nomination later in the broadcast with Indigenous activist Winona LaDuke. President-elect Joe Biden's nominating North Carolina's top environmental official, Michael Regan, to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. If confirmed, Regan would become the second black man to head the EPA. He previously worked at the agency under Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Congressmember and incoming director of the White House Office of Public Engagement, Cedric Richmond, has tested positive for the coronavirus 2 days after he appeared at an event in Georgia with Joe Biden. Biden has reportedly tested negative for the virus Thursday. Richmond and Biden interacted outdoors for less than 15 total minutes, and both wore masks throughout the event. In immigration news, advocates say 28 children and their families are scheduled to be deported this morning, including a 4-year-old girl with a broken arm in need of surgery. The families are from Central and South America and Haiti. Their attorneys argue the families were never given a fair chance to seek asylum in the U.S. and that the parents had refused to be separated from their children as they fought their cases. In Nigeria, local officials say 344 schoolboys who were abducted last Friday from their school in northwestern Katsina State have been freed. Details about the mass kidnapping are still unclear. Boko Haram initially claimed responsibility, but a state official now says they were not involved. On Capitol Hill, members of the billionaire Sackler family refused to apologize Thursday as House lawmakers grilled them over their role in fueling the devastating opioid epidemic. The Sacklers own Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin. The company pleaded guilty last month to 3 criminal charges, including bribing doctors to write more prescriptions for the highly addictive drug. Sackler family members have not been criminally charged. This is Massachusetts Congressmember Ayanna Pressley addressing David Sackler.
We do not need another failed war on drugs. What we need is a reckoning and accountability for drug companies who put profits over people and rob us of lives and freedom of our loved ones. You have created a nationwide epidemic. 450,000 people have died. Let me be clear. People struggling with addiction are not criminals. Your family and Purdue Pharma, you are the criminals. You are the ones who disregard your duties to society, and you should be ashamed of yourselves.
Thursday's hearing came as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported the U.S. had more than 81,000 overdose deaths over the past year, the highest number ever recorded, and nearly 20,000 more than last year. Death row prisoner Dustin John Higgs has contracted COVID-19 ahead of his scheduled execution on January 15th. Higgs is among over 300 prisoners in the federal prison at Terre Haute, Indiana, who've tested positive for COVID-19, including prisoners on death row. A guard working on the unit also tested positive. Higgs' attorney said the outbreak is likely due to the rushed executions carried out by the Trump administration during the pandemic. So far this year, 10 people have been put to death by the federal government, the most since 1896. Dozens of attorneys general from across 35 states have launched an antitrust lawsuit against Google, accusing the tech giant of anti-competitive actions that protect the company's general search monopolies, depriving consumers of choices. The lawsuit filed Thursday is one of 3 antitrust cases against Google. In related news, Google employees are demanding senior leadership reinstate prominent black researcher Timnit Gebru, who alleged she was fired earlier this month after arguing tech companies should do more to ensure gender-biased and racist language are not exacerbated by artificial intelligence systems. And in labor news, the New York City Council passed legislation that protects fast food workers from being fired without a valid reason. Council member Adrienne Adams authored the bill.
Before the pandemic, fast food workers performed dangerous and physically demanding work, but now as essential workers, their jobs have become more dangerous, putting their health and families' health at risk. In exchange, they are often faced with impossible choices: endure hostile working conditions, leave, or be fired and face financial struggle without a job. Just Cause legislation is about giving working families economic stability and security. And most importantly, this is about treating workers with respect and dignity.
Those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As U.S. hospitalizations from COVID-19 hit another record high, we begin today's show looking at the crisis of evictions and how millions across the country could be forced to leave their homes in the middle of the pandemic if Congress does not extend the federal eviction moratorium that's due to expire at the end of the year. Congress is expected to extend the moratorium by 1 month to January 31st in the $900 billion stimulus bill currently still being debated in Washington. But this is just a temporary fix. The U.S. Census Bureau reports 1/3 of U.S. households are behind on rent or mortgage payments and will likely face eviction or foreclosure in the next 2 months. Meanwhile, many have already faced eviction despite the national moratorium. New research finds more than 400,000 COVID-19 cases and nearly 11,000 deaths resulted from evictions, after many states allowed eviction moratoriums to expire over the summer. The co-author of this research joins us now in Los Angeles, California, the new epicenter of the pandemic. Catherine Leifheit is a researcher at UCLA's Fielding School of Public Health. And in Kansas City, we're joined by Tara Raghuveer, director of KC Tenants, a tenants' right organization in Kansas City, director of the national campaign Homes Guarantee. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Tara, let's begin with you in Kansas City. Lay out the national problem that we're seeing here. Record deaths, record hospitalizations, record infections around the coronavirus. And this federal moratorium on evictions is due to end at the end of this year, in just a few weeks.
It's important to realize that the federal moratorium that's due to end wasn't good enough to begin with. It didn't come until September, and that was months after people in places like Kansas City had been evicted and forced to the streets in the middle of a global pandemic. The CDC moratorium only covers one type of eviction, and those are evictions for non-payment of rent. It leaves a lot open to local interpretation, and it puts the burden on tenants to apply for that protection. So the CDC moratorium was not good enough, but the CDC moratorium allowed to expire at the end of the month leaves hundreds of thousands, millions of families vulnerable to eviction within the first 20 days of the next year.
And explain the difference between federal evictions and other evictions. How is it, what does federal apply to?
So the CDC moratorium applied ostensibly to every property in the country and was available for any tenant who needed protection. Previously, there was only eviction protection for buildings that got some kind of federal financing. But in September, the CDC went further than that. The problem, though, was that the federal moratorium left a lot to local interpretation. So here in Kansas City, for example, the presiding judge of our circuit court decided that he was still going to allow landlords to file evictions, and the judges were still going to hear evictions, and they were still going to issue eviction judgments for those cases where the tenant hadn't gotten the right information to protect themselves under the CDC moratorium.
So you recently tweeted out, Tara, if people get checks, but we don't cancel rent, those aren't stimulus checks, they're an industry bailout. Explain.
The tenants in the streets, the tenants in their homes have been demanding rent and mortgage cancellation since March because tenants were always clear that in the face of unprecedented public health and economic crisis, they should not be responsible for what is the largest bill for every American family across race and class lines. But months into the pandemic, tenants are still being held responsible for their rent payment. And the fact is that the rent eats first. That is to say, if a family gets a check, whether it's for $600 or $1,200, that money goes first to their landlord. So that does not stimulate the economy. That does not put food on the table. That does not help their family survive this traumatic moment. All that does is enrich the property owner to whom they owe their rent.
In November, members of KC tenants were detained by police when they tried to halt the eviction of a woman from her apartment in Raytown, Missouri, who said she had nowhere else to go.
Get off the property. The police are coming.
Why are you evicting someone in a pandemic?
Last week, hundreds of protesters marched here in New York and Brooklyn to the housing court, demanding an end to evictions and to cancel rent.
We are the tenants! We are the tenants! The mighty, mighty tenants! The mighty, mighty tenants! Fighting for justice! Fighting for justice! Cancel rent! Cancel rent!
So, and those are sounds from the streets of Brooklyn. And, of course, that first eviction was right around the issue in Kansas City involving your group, KC Tenants. If you can talk about what that eviction was all about, often specifics capture people's attention more than the mass numbers, which is horrifying. And also, even the people throwing people out, like those who are brought in with sheriffs, you see them online weeping and saying, I'm taking out this person's furniture and I'm probably next.
That's right. So Amanda, whose eviction we disrupted in Raytown, Missouri, is a cancer survivor. She was living by herself. She wasn't even behind on her rent. She was being evicted because the property manager was basically sick of her abuser showing up and causing trouble at the apartment complex. She's a domestic violence survivor, and she was basically evicted for calling for support in her domestic violence case. And it was true. She had nowhere to go that night. So we showed up to execute this kind of blockade as a way of both supporting Amanda and showing her solidarity, but also exposing the fact that sheriff's evictions are still happening right now. Because the fact is, for a lot of people who aren't impacted by these types of events, there's the ability to ignore that our state is sanctioning this kind of violence. So we wanted to put that on blast, and I think we effectively did so. And tenants across the country are taking matters into their own hands, shutting down eviction court, shutting down these blockading these types of evictions that sheriffs are executing as a way of saying that, you know, if we don't have justice, we won't allow for any peace.
Catherine Leitheit, you did this major national study at UCLA, linking the lifting of eviction moratoriums to an increase in COVID-19 cases and deaths. Explain what you found.
Right. So to understand this relationship between evictions and COVID in this context of a pandemic, we looked at eviction moratoriums that were implemented and then lifted at the state level. So 44 states or 43 states in the District of Columbia implemented an eviction moratorium between March and September, and then 27 of those states went on to lift the moratorium over the summer. So what we did is we compared the states that had lifted their moratoriums to those that kept their moratoriums in place. And we found that the states that lifted their moratoriums had 430,000 more COVID cases and over 10,000 more COVID deaths. So we think these deaths are preventable, and they could have been prevented had those moratoriums been kept in place.
Explain more explicitly the connection.
Right. So when people get evicted, often they have limited options about where they go next. You know, these things happen very quickly and they're violent, as Tara's been explaining. So people often move in with friends or family if they have that option. If not, they might enter a homeless shelter. And both of those things increase your number of household contacts, they increase crowding. And we know that household transmission and crowding are two of the main mechanisms that drive up COVID transmission. And it's important to note that this doesn't only increase COVID risk for folks who get evicted, but for the entire community.
The study wasn't peer-reviewed, but you decided to get it out even in advance of that. Why?
Right. So we thought that this was such urgently needed evidence for advocates and policymakers. The study's awaiting peer review, but we wanted to make sure that policymakers had these numbers in hand as they're making decisions about rent relief and whether or not to extend state and national eviction moratoriums.
You know, it's interesting. I don't know how many people picked up on this federal moratorium was issued by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which really underscores the connection between evictions and public health, Catherine.
Yes, that's right. So I did my dissertation looking at links between eviction moratoriums and chronic health outcomes. So things like birth outcomes when pregnant moms experience eviction, or food insecurity, cognitive development, lead poisoning for children. So we'd been talking about eviction as a public health problem for a while, but then to have the CDC come out in the context of the pandemic and say that this was their rationale for the moratorium was really powerful.
And we have to wrap up soon, but I do want to ask you which communities are most impacted.
Right. So Black and Latinx communities are disproportionately burdened by evictions. And of course, those are the same communities that are getting battered by COVID. So we really worry that these evictions could potentially broaden disparities that are already wide in COVID cases and deaths.
And your response to Joe Biden choosing Congressmember Fudge to head the HUD, Housing and Urban Development, what you think needs to be the new policy around housing and particularly how it affects children?
Right. So, of course, affordable housing isn't a new problem, and we already had a housing affordability crisis before this pandemic. So we need to do everything we can to make sure that folks have safe, affordable housing so that people are not just one crisis or economic shock away from losing their homes.
And Tara Raghavir, as we wrap, if you can talk about the difference that these actions have made when people come out. I mean, we're talking about in these next days, this federal moratorium on evictions is scheduled to end. But even with it in place, so many people are being evicted. What do you think is the most effective response?
For us, the most effective response here in Kansas City and in the tenant movement across the country has been to take radical direct action to shut down every instance of evictions. So we've been disrupting the remote eviction hearings in court, and we've been showing up for blockades. We've been training others to do the same. And as far as we're concerned, especially in a state like Missouri, where our governor, where our judges are not listening to tenants, do not care about working people, the only thing we have to do is take action, take collective action, and shut down the rotten systems that are keeping our people in such pain.
Tara Raghavir, Director of KC Tenants, Catherine Leifheit, researcher at UCLA's Fielding School of Public Health, and we will link to your report at democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. When we come back, an historic nomination, first Native American to head the Interior Department. We'll get response from Indigenous leader Winona LaDuke. Stay with us.
Save the river, save the seas, save the mother and her family. How can you take what you want and say that we are free? If you put oil in the water, we won't sit quietly. And they were singing, stand up for what's right. Don't walk silently into the night.
For You by Ray Zaragoza. This is Democracy Now!, the democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President-elect Joe Biden has nominated New Mexico Congressmember Deb Haaland to become Secretary of the Interior. If confirmed, she'll be the first Native American to serve in a cabinet position. Haaland's nomination was backed by progressives as well as more than 120 tribal leaders who sent a letter to Joe Biden last month urging him to select her for the post. Haaland responded in a statement, quote, "As our country faces the impacts of climate change and environmental injustice, the Interior has a role, and I will be a partner in addressing these challenges by protecting our public lands and moving our country towards a clean energy future," she said. Journalist Julian Brave Noisecat tweeted, "After 4 years of fossil fuel executives and lobbyists opening up native lands and sacred sites to industry tycoons, the next Secretary of Interior will be a Laguna Pueblo woman who went to Standing Rock in 2016 and cooked for the people," unquote. Deb Haaland's appointment comes as the struggle against the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline continues in Minnesota after construction began 2 weeks ago. Indigenous and environmental activists have been holding daily protests against the project, which would carry tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada, to a terminal in Superior, Wisconsin, cutting through Indigenous territory and running under more than 200 streams. On Monday, 22 water protectors were arrested in the freezing cold at a Line 3 construction site. Well, for more on Deb Haaland's historic nomination and the ongoing resistance at Line 3, we're joined in Sandy Lake, Minnesota by Winona LaDuke, Executive Director of Honor the Earth and Rural Development economist. She is the author of the upcoming book, To Be a Water Protector. Winona lives and works on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. Winona, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you start off by talking about the significance of Deb Haaland to be the first Native American to head the Interior Department, if approved by the Senate, not to mention to be a cabinet member, as far as we know. You were a longtime supporter of her, back to when she ran for Congress.
I just want to say one thing. That would be an affirmation from all of us over here in the Indian country. You know, that was a very, very important step for the Biden administration. You know, Indian people know how to take care of this land. And Deb Haaland comes from Laguna Pueblo, which has one of the largest uranium mining histories in this country. And I just want to really, with the Anaconda uranium mine destroying so much of their territory, really grateful for this and this new point, this vision that we're going to have. There's a lot of work to do to undo what the Trump administration has done, and we are really, really grateful that the Biden administration has taken these steps.
And can you talk about what Deb Haaland stands for? She is a Congress member from New Mexico. She talked immediately about sustainable development and what the Interior Department does.
Well, the Interior Department is kind of like the great white father of Indian people. And so mines and Indians are both in the same department. And what's happened is that the Interior Department and the federal government has basically given away so much of the land, water, and resources of Indian country under the Trump administration and previous administrations. And so, you know, let's just say the public lands and the native lands should be protected for the public and the natives, not necessarily some mining corporations. Deb's history here with the vision that she and other leaders have had in Washington with the just transition and the Green New Deal is exactly what we need in this country. We don't need any more fossil fuels. We're done. We're done. What we need is the vision and a just transition.
And who has run the Interior Department before? I mean, what have been the policies before? And what are the pressures she'll be under? Many have talked about Joe Biden's cabinet being largely still from corporate establishment America. And certainly Deb Haaland comes from a very different place.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that Deb can stand up to the challenges and she'll have a lot of support. I mean, I think that we should be done with appointing corporate heads to run parts of our government. They have enough influence already. And so in this moment in time, you have vast territories of lands that she's going to be able to look at and, really provide some redress from what the Trump administration has done and basically deconstructing any environmental regulations we had and any protection of public lands that we had, so significant prior to this, all white males, in this position. And so we're really grateful that the new administration has seen the merits of the championship of the environment and of Native people, of someone like Deb Haaland.
And the significance of her going to Standing Rock, which brings us to Enbridge 3 and what this is all about, these very similar struggles. And if you can make the connections, back in 2016, I was with you at Standing Rock covering what you were doing. You pitched your tent there. And Deb Haaland was there also.
Yes, she was. A lot of people came to Standing Rock and were politicized because it's this moment in time that we realize that the rights of corporations have superseded the rights of people. And the question is, let us protect our water. The Standing Rock DAPL battle came after our successful defeat of Enbridge in the line in the Sandpiper, a fracked oil pipeline that Enbridge wanted to put through our territory. After that project was canceled in 2016, the company purchased 28% of the Dakota Access Pipeline and proceeded to ram a pipeline through. Really bad idea, in North Dakota, and was faced with all of the water protectors, And so what we've seen is that this is the end of the fossil fuel era. I mean, the fact is that the price of oil was it minus $38 a barrel in the spring? I mean, that wasn't even my economics class. And then you have this, reduction in oil consumption, the crashing of the tar sands industry. I mean, company after company is bailing out of the tar sands, and the closure of refineries in the United States. And so we're at this point in time where the industry is ending, and there's certainly no reason to approve a new tar sands pipeline. It's like the last tar sands pipeline at the end of the fossil fuel era. So we are sitting here in northern Minnesota, and we have been standing against Enbridge's proposal. For 7 years, the Anishinaabe, all 70,000 people came out and testified against this pipeline for 7 years. We've been saying this is a bad idea. It was a really bad idea when it was initially proposed, and now in 2020, with both the price of oil, the state of climate disaster we are in, and the projections in the future for moving towards electric cars, there is no need for this pipeline. There wasn't a need before, and there's not a need now, certainly. And yet Enbridge is trying to shove it through. We call this the pandemic pipeline. I mean, Governor Walz from Minnesota, really remarkable decision, approved all of the permits for the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. A day later, Governor Whitmer of Michigan withdrew the easements for the Enbridge pipeline project underneath the Straits of Mackinac, citing the public trust doctrine, saying that the interests of the people in the state superseded the interests of a Canadian multinational corporation. Really a stark comparison, because we're sitting here in northern Minnesota, 65, 66-year-old women are getting arrested, minus 2 degrees out there, to protect our water. All kind of people are getting arrested, all kind of people are coming up here, and it's a pandemic. What we see is Walz approved 4,200 workers coming in from out of state. These are pipeline workers from other failed projects like the Keystone XL. All the other failed pipeline projects are coming in from Texas, they're coming in from Utah, from Wyoming, from Michigan, to put in a pipeline that nobody wants. And it's really brutal up here. So, what we see is an opportunity for change.
I want to go to Shanae Madison, one of the protesters who came out Tuesday for a demonstration outside an Enbridge Energy office in Minnesota.
My name is Shanae, and I came over here from northern Aiken County, where Enbridge is already getting ready to drill beneath the Willow River and the Mississippi River. And that's where my family has been for 5 generations. It's a place where my grandma was born, and it really hurts to see how much destruction has been done in just the last 2 weeks. So I'm standing here in support of and in allyship with the Native-led movement to stop Line 3, but also because I am tired of my people being lied to. That these are the good jobs destroying the place that we come from.
So that's Shanae Madison, one of the protesters at a Tuesday action. Earlier this month, an Anishinaabe woman named Dawn Goodwin sat in front of a machine that was brought in to clear trees for construction. If you can also describe that scene and the various direct actions and protests that are taking place. You described the action of the Minnesota governor. He is a Democrat.
Yes, that's right. And for some reason, Tim Walz thought this was a good idea. At the end of all this conflict, this is like blood oil. When you got people getting arrested, it's, minus 2 degrees. You've got all this brutality occurring in the north. And, in the middle of a pandemic where you import all these workers and you only got 4 ICU beds in a county, so much conflict. At the end of it, he's going to have 23 jobs. What a poor decision he's made. What we really want is the opportunity for a just transition. In Minnesota, we're going to be fighting over rocks and pipes for the rest of our lives, and rocks and pipes for the rest of our lives and into, for the next 20 years, unless we come up with a better plan, one that could bring local jobs. And that's what Shania is talking about, because all people have been given here is project proposals by multinational corporations. And it's really time for far more vision than that. Across the line, there are people opposing this pipeline, and we are just getting started. In addition to that, our tribes all filed, along with citizens organizations, appeals for every step of the process, including the certificate of need and the route permit that was issued by the state of Minnesota. I mean, they don't have a spill plan for Lake Superior. They couldn't meet the water quality standards, and their need projections were based on what Enbridge wished need would be, not the reality of a decreased demand for oil. So here we are, standing here and watching the crunching of our forests, these giant machines called a feller buncher. They drive through and just destroy and consume forests in this pathway of death that Enbridge is bringing here to northern Minnesota. So we were sitting there praying at our lodge, and Dawn seen that machine coming, and she was just so upset with it. She just sat and was crying and was shaking. And then she's praying, and the next thing you know, Don Goodwin has stopped a machine. And that machine has not restarted. That machine has not restarted on the banks of the Mississippi River, where our people still stand.
So I wanted to also ask you about another issue. This has to do with sports news. The Cleveland Indians baseball team has announced it's changing its name after years of protests from Native American advocates and fans. I wanted to ask you about the whole issue. Interestingly, the team was named over 100 years ago for a Native American player that had not been recognized. But Indigenous groups have been fighting for decades. The Indian Psychologists Association put out a letter saying this demeans us. This, of course, follows the removal of the name of the Washington national team, as it's referred to now. Its former name will not go mentioned. Talk about this movement and what it means to you.
I think it's really a reclaiming of our right to define who we are and not having someone else say who we are. Being a mom, being a grandma, you see these kids and all of a sudden they see this big sign for Indians has nothing to do with them. It has really been an appropriation of who we are and making a lot of money off of Native people for all these years and a lot of disparaging, chants and such things. We're done. And it's an interesting year. I mean, we've all been here. And, in my life, I didn't expect to see so many statues falling. How many years we try to get those Columbus statues to fall? Many years. They're all down. And then here the names are going too. So the social movement of justice, and people's right to say who they are is surging. And I'm really just grateful to this transition in names and being able to move forward. I got some questions about sports teams in general, but let's just leave us out of it. And let's affirm Native people for who we are. And how about a little bit more respect in general, like, how about our water? How about our land? How about our language? How about our sacred sites? That'd be good. You don't need to chant about me. You just need to let's just talk about what justice looks like.
Winona, you were a Green Party candidate for vice president, along with Ralph Nader when he was running for president. As you look at the incoming administration shaping up and the battle going on in Congress right now, you have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calling for new Democratic leadership. What do you want to see? What have you been concerned about in this lame duck period, in this transition period? And what do you feel needs to happen, this on the 5th anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement?
Well, it's obvious that the Trump administration has been trying to shove through every bad idea, possible in their final days. And we've seen that, most of those are being challenged in court and the rest of them will be challenged as well, because what, Trump has done is just make a mess, a worse mess than ever. But what we really need is new leadership. I mean, the fact is that, You know, what we've seen is a bunch of guys looking at the playbook that was written in the last century. In a time of climate disaster, the fact is that you don't need any more fossil fuels. What you need is a just transition. We need to make things in this country that matter instead of import everything from someplace else. You need to rebuild kind of a manufacturing sector in this country so that we have real jobs for real people here that is based on justice and not based on, huge amounts of toxic contamination. You need to build a renewable energy sector. I mean, I sit here in northern Minnesota, and the irony of it is you're looking at pipes moving, and right behind them are wind turbine parts moving. And they're coming in to the port of Duluth, the furthest inland port, because they all get imported from overseas, from Europe and from China. We don't make wind turbine parts in this country. We import them by and large from overseas. And so you see these small rural roads in the north full of pipelines and full of wind turbine parts. And I'm like, let's just move on. Time to move on. Let's quit fighting over rocks and pipes, and let's move it to something where we have an economy that's not based on conflict. That's the opportunity for this administration. That's the opportunity for the Walz administration to move on, to make a just transition, to build an economy based on peace, respect, and justice. That's what we want.
And Winona, last question. In this time of the pandemic, we just have 20 seconds, but it has ripped through Native America. Can you talk about the situation?
No, I mean, my community itself has lost some people, and more of us are getting lost. We're the highest risk people, in Minnesota, are Native people. And we just want, we are doing our best to stay safe. And we didn't appreciate the 4,200 workers that Governor Walz brought into our communities. Now's the time to stay safe, stay isolated, and, prepare for spring, because spring will surely come, and we'll plant new seeds, of hope, justice, and food for our people.
Winona LaDuke, we thank you so much for being with us, Executive Director of Honor the Earth. Looking forward to your upcoming book, To Be a Water Protector. When we come back, we go to Kabul, Afghanistan. A shocking new expose reveals CIA-trained and funded Afghan death squads have targeted Islamic religious schools, killing boys as young as 8 years old. We'll speak with the reporter. Stay with us. Sweet Child by the Afghan Music Project. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A shocking expose out today in The Intercept reveals CIA-backed death squads in Afghanistan have killed children as young as 8 years old in a series of night raids, many targeting madrasas, Islamic religious schools. In December 2018, one of the death squads attacked a madrasa in Wardak province, killing 12 boys, the youngest 9 years old. The killers are believed to be from a CIA-trained and funded paramilitary unit known as 01. The United States played key roles in many of the raids, from picking targets to ferrying Afghan forces to the sites to providing lethal air power during the raids. The Intercept reports this was part of a campaign of terror orchestrated by the Trump administration that included massacres, executions, mutilation, forced disappearances, attacks on medical facilities, and airstrikes targeting structures known to house civilians. The Intercept has documented 10 night raids that resulted in at least 51 civilian deaths in the months leading up to the peace talks with the Taliban. The campaign of terror appears to have been timed to force the Taliban to the negotiating table. The 0-1 death squad all but vanished earlier this year after the U.S. and Taliban signed the Doha Agreement. Earlier this week, General Mark Milley, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, met with Taliban negotiators in Qatar for unannounced talks. We go now to Kabul, Afghanistan, to speak with the journalist Andrew Quilty, Australian reporter and photojournalist who's been based in Afghanistan for many years. His new piece is just out, titled The CIA's Afghan Death Squads. Andrew, welcome to Democracy Now! Tell us what you found and describe the boy, the young man, 12 years old, Bilal, and the horror he described.
Thanks for having me, Amy. Yeah, you've given a great synopsis there of what me and The Intercept found in our reporting over several months this year and last. Bilal, who was one of the survivors and one of the witnesses of the worst raid of the 10 that we documented in great detail, was, as you said, 12 years old, and he was one of about 25 young Islamic school students who stay overnight in these madrasas because they live too far away to go back and forth each day. So on this night, in fact, it was 2 years to the day that this raid occurred, and he was there with, as I said, 25 other students. They had eaten a basic meal of beans and bread and gone to sleep when at about 10 or 10:30 at night they started hearing the buzz of drones overhead. And soon after that, a number of soldiers burst through the door. They detonated an explosive device to enter the building. And soon after that, a couple of soldiers burst into the room where he was staying with about another 10 boys, and they dragged the two oldest looking boys out of that room, took them into another room, along with 10 other older looking students. But as you already discussed, some of them were as young as 8 or 9 years old. And minutes after that, he and another boy who were in the madrasa described hearing multiple gunshots from what they described as several different weapons. And what they discovered early the next morning when people from the village came to their rescue after the raiders had left the site and left the village was that those 12 boys that had been taken out of the several dormitories had been massacred in a room. Bilal and 5 other witnesses from that night, including another boy who survived the massacre, and 4 other villagers who either saw or heard the events of the night, described hearing or seeing Americans or English speakers amongst those who committed the raid.
So talk more about, and I mean, you've delved deeply into this massacre and others, the connection between the Afghan forces that are carrying this out, who they are, and their U.S. backers.
It's a very shadowy organisation and very difficult to find out information. But from all the reporting I've done and others have done over the years, we understand that these militias, this network of militias, and there's about 6 or 7 of them throughout the country, were established in the very early days of the Afghan war by CIA officers, many of whom had been brought back into the fold after the invasion of Afghanistan in late 2001, who had previously been working in Afghanistan during the 1980s when the CIA was helping to fund the Mujahideen against the Soviet occupation at that time. So this network of militias was set up and appeared to be entirely under the control of the CIA, but made up of entirely of Afghan soldiers. They are better trained, better paid, better armed than their conventional force counterparts in Afghanistan. And it's actually not often that you hear about them. Often the only time you do hear about them is when atrocities like those that we have documented in Wardak in the last couple of years make headlines. And in fact, it's very rare that they do make headlines, because the places that these militias tend to operate are deep in Taliban-controlled territory, where often there's very limited access to communications and media, and often the information that does come out is denigrated as propaganda, which the Taliban are well known for using. But it's been in more recent years, in fact, since the Trump administration started to undertake peace talks with the Taliban regime in Doha, Qatar, that these militias have come back to the fore and been extremely active in certain parts of the country, and in particular in Wardak province, which neighbours Kabul. You could drive to the capital of Wardak from where I'm sitting right now in an hour.
I want to turn to Mike Pompeo, speaking in 2017. At the time, he was head of the CIA before becoming Secretary of State.
We can't perform our mission if we're not aggressive, vicious, unforgiving, relentless. You pick the word. Every minute we have to be focused on crushing our enemies.
And this is President Trump speaking about Afghanistan in 2017.
We are not nation building again. We are killing terrorists.
So there you have it, Pompeo and Trump in 2017. And it makes me think about what you write in your piece. The prevalence of boys among those killed in Wardak indicates that 01, that unit that did the massacre, it makes me think that 01 was trying to eliminate not only existing enemies, but potential future foes as well. Talk more explicitly about what Trump and Pompeo are doing right now, and at this point when Milley has just met with the Taliban in Qatar.
What they're doing right now, well, they're coming to potentially the end of their involvement in Afghanistan, something that President Trump had campaigned on back in 2016. And from all my reporting, it's my understanding that Trump wanted to get out, as we all know, of Afghanistan, get his forces out of Afghanistan by the end of his term. In a four-year term in the context of a 20-year war is not a lot of time at all. And as it's often said, it's much easier to get into war than get out of one. So the way I see it is that Trump wanted to exert maximum force in the minimum amount of time to coerce the Taliban at the negotiating table and put them in a position where they had to concede to their terms in the negotiating process. So while these raids were going on, and while the Taliban were being pummeled all over Afghanistan and being pressured at the negotiating table, you had this strange contradiction of the rhetoric of peace in Doha, in all the public pronouncements and public rhetoric, contradicted by what was going on the ground in Afghanistan, which far from this rhetoric, as I say. What the peace talks led to in February this year was the signing of what's known as the Doha Agreement, which was it wasn't a peace deal, but it was an agreement that was hoped would lead to a peace deal down the track. It mandated a timeline for withdrawal of American forces, and and that is coming up to end in theory in April or May next year. Now, since then, since the February signing of the Doha Agreement, it was hoped, it was anticipated by the American government and the Afghan government that it would coincide with a decrease in violence in the country. That has not occurred. So it seems as though Trump's theory that pummeling the Taliban into submission has not worked. And in fact, the Taliban seem to be as strong now as at any other time in the war. This at a time where they can see the end of the road for the American involvement in the country, and certainly an opening, a greater opening than they've ever witnessed before, to regaining the power that they had in the late 90s and 2001.
I just want to express how important it is to be speaking to you in Kabul. You have been doing this work for this one investigation for about 18 months. Internet access is not easy. The threat that journalists face, like you, and particularly Afghan journalist, one TV broadcaster, she was just gunned down, assassinated with her driver recently, and also what questions you want to see answered right now coming out of this investigation. And finally, the kind of pressure the President Ashraf Ghani is under for working with the U.S. government at a time when, while we have not heard about 01, certainly in Afghanistan, they know about these shadowy forces, the people themselves, because of the number of raids and massacres and where it gets around.
Look, strangely enough, I think the questions that I want answered would also be the questions that the president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, and his national security advisor and his cabinet would want answered, and that is who on earth controls these units who are operating in their country without their permission. I spoke to the national security advisor here, and he was at a loss to explain how these units operated, let alone who controls them. He did admit that the CIA were in control of them, but beyond that, there doesn't seem to be understanding or correspondence with their Afghan counterparts. These units, just to go back to a little bit about how they operate and how little oversight there is, they're paid in US dollars in cash. So they're not even, the Afghan government isn't even aware of who is making up the numbers in their units, whereas with their conventional forces, all the units are paid through an electronic system, which is backed up by biometric data, which none of the members of these units have to undertake. You mentioned the risk to journalists here. It's been something that has come about particularly in recent months. In Kabul and other provincial capitals,
we have 10 seconds.
A big increase in targeted attacks, many of which are targeting journalists and human rights activists.
Well, Andrew Quilty, we want you to stay safe. Thank you so much. Australian photojournalist based in Afghanistan. We'll link to your Intercept expose at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Wear a mask. Stay safe.